So today I'm here with Sarah Iles Johnston, and we are talking today about a paper that you wrote back in, I think it was 2011. Whose Gods Are These? A Classicist Look at Neopaganism. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing?
Great. It's a pleasure to be here.
For those who are not familiar with this paper, can you give a brief summary or overview of what the paper is about, what it entails, kind of the objectives or goals of the paper?
There were two sort of sets of objectives. One was that a dear friend of mine was turning 70 and his students were collecting papers in his honor by scholars, and I was asked to contribute. The guy's name is Philippe Bourgeot. He's a wonderful French historian of ancient religions. And I knew that Philippe was really interested in the creative ways in which religion, or religions, plural, I should say, can be used. So I saw this as an opportunity to finally pursue my longtime interest in neo-paganism. It kind of gave me the open door to indulge in that. So that was one purpose, which I think is important to realize, both because it tells you right away I had never worked on it before, but also that I see neo-paganism as one among many other religions. I don't see it as being terribly unusual as
Mhm.
religions go. I respect it as I respect all religions. But then to get back to better answering your question, I think the reason it had always fascinated me is that it is a religion which, and I mean this in a positive sense, is largely created by those who practice it.
Your paper focuses on how neo-pagans use scholarly works, academic work, to create the religions. I think the term is poaching in the stacks, and I love that phrase. I think it captures the essence of what is happening there. Could you explain a little bit what that is, and how does that maybe cross into appropriation or cultural appropriation in any way?
So I poached that term from Sabina Maliocco, who is both a neo-pagan herself and an eminent scholar of neo-paganism. And she had poached it from Michel de Certeau, an anthropologist, who used it to describe what um, educated practitioners of cultural practices, including religions, do. In other words, they go to the library and they read up on it. And this was already explored to some extent in Tanya Luhrmann's book of, I think, 1996, Persuasions of the Witch's Craft, where she described the English practitioners that she studied as being absolutely bibliomaniacs. They were reading novels about the Middle Ages. They were reading fantasy works such as The Lord of the Rings. And they were, quote unquote, poaching from all of these sources in order to construct their particular strand of neo-paganism.
Understood.
Oh, and you were asking, how is it different from cultural appropriation?
Yeah, how does it overlap with so my particular thing, what I do, I combat and confront cultural appropriation of Hellenism, particularly within neo-paganism, and I was just wondering how does maybe poaching the stacks blur into, or overlap with perhaps cultural appropriation itself. So for if you're not aware, so within American paganism and other forms of paganism in more of the Anglophonic sphere,
Mhm.
they've appropriated, some pagans have appropriated the identity of Greek people, Hellenism, as a faith-based like pagan religion, in terms of if someone were to say, I believe in Athena, I do Hellenism. They've created an entire neo-pagan religion out of the term which Greek people use to identify their identity and culture. So that's what a lot of the work that I do is to kind of show how that is happening and where it happens. Your paper itself actually inspired me to do a lot of that work currently, because I've been reviewing some books that have been coming out, and I see how the academic material is being used or where it's not being used, the selective process of sources. So it's been your paper was actually very helpful in understanding the process of American pagans.
I'm really glad it was helpful. I guess my response to your question then is twofold. First of all, I've noticed that, at least among academics, and I think in the general public, the term appropriation, either cultural appropriation or just appropriation, is a negative one. It means someone doing something in an illegitimate way. Very often that's associated in both academia and the outside world with the idea that someone doesn't have a right to be taking something. So I'll just make up an example that a woman goes to the southwest part of America and sees Native Americans performing a ritual and thinks it's really cool. And so she goes home to Columbus, Ohio, where I live. I'm still making this up, and says, well, I'm going to perform that ritual. And she thinks that she is genuinely performing the ritual. To me, that would be appropriation because she has taken very few pains and made very little effort to really understand what the ritual is, how it's being used by those who I will say it belongs to. That in itself is a problematic term, of course, but she's being very limited in her exploration of what the ritual is and means. So that's what I mean when I say appropriation is often a very negative term. It could be resurrected with a more positive meaning, of course, to simply mean any act of borrowing of a cultural product. And at this point, I'll say, I think a lot of people who are accused of appropriating, in fact, aren't in any negative way. They're
Yeah. I think
yeah.
there's good
Oh
faith
yeah,
there in a lot of
absolutely.
people.
And maybe
Yeah.
in fact this first act of, what the outside world is calling appropriation could lead to that person slowly becoming more and more deeply involved in that religion. In fact, I would say that almost everyone who embraces a religion, at least as adults, whether they started as children or only started as adults, they are appropriating, and they're only slowly learning what that really means. And if they decide they want to stick with it, I guess then we don't call it appropriation anymore. But the term is a problematic one for me, as I guess you're figuring out.
Now, as a scholar, as a classicist, and you know that pagans rely heavily on academic sources and writings, does that impact how you may write in the future? Like, do you have pagans in the back of your mind when you write about anything now?
Uh, Again, yes and no, in the sense that I have always, as long as I've been a scholar or been intending to be a scholar of religion, I've always striven to be very respectful of
Hmm.
not just those who I'm writing about, which in 99% of the cases are the ancient Greeks, and so they probably don't know whether I'm being respectful or not, but also of anyone reading. So that's part of the answer. But the other part of the answer is sometimes when I read my older work, I realize I was not achieving that goal that I set out for myself. And so it's an ongoing process. I'm striving to be respectful. I think I wandered off your question onto a different question.
Possibly, it's okay. Wherever we go, we go. That's how I like to converse.
Okay.
However this naturally flows. Yeah.
So I think you were asking me whether I do things.
Yeah, like yeah, in any of your current writings or your any books that you write when you are writing about the ancient world, the ancient Greek religions, stuff like that. In what capacity do the knowing that there are pagans
Okay,
today
right.
who might be reading what you're going to publish, does it impact you in any way, like in what you write and what you publish, knowing that people might take that and construct a religion out of it?
Yeah. To go back to Sabina Maliocco for a moment, I knew her work and then I met her, I guess it's 15 to 20 years ago. And what became a friendship with her is extremely important to me, both as a scholar and just as a ordinary person. So hanging around with Sabina, although I don't see her as often as I'd like to, hanging around with Sabina has made me better aware of what at least some types of neo-pagans value, what they might be able to take away from my work that would either upset them or please them. And although it's never the main thing I'm thinking about when I'm writing a scholarly paper, it's always there in the back of my mind now that what I'm talking about is something that at least some of my readers, it's going to potentially affect their religious outlook. It's going to potentially make them feel criticized. So that lifelong struggle I've had with learning how to better write respectfully about religion and yet remain a scholar
Hmm.
has been, uh,
It's an interesting process,
yeah, yeah,
right?
it's an interesting process, and Sabina has made it more interesting.
Oh, very good. I'm glad there's a collaboration there between pagan studies and scholars such as yourself in the classics. I think there's more work that could probably be done there as well. I think there is a role for classicists to perhaps help pagans in some way, I guess, who are studying these things, particularly how to better understand sources.
Hmm.
I know in your paper, one of the things that I highlighted in the paper was this, you identified how pagans are selective in the books that they will choose from. Can you explain perhaps one or both types of books that pagans typically select?
One is what I'll call the encyclopedic book, and a really good example of that is Walter Burkhart's Greek Religion,
That's always number
which,
one on the reading list.
well, I'm going to subsequently in the conversation, if you remind me, I'll tell you about one that's about to come out that
Yes.
will probably replace it. So, yeah, Walter Burkhart's book is a really good example of what I'll call the encyclopedic. The other is what I'll call the, oh, I know I had a really good term for this in my article, and I'm trying to remember what it was. But essentially, it's works that evoke the feeling of the religion as neo-pagans
Oh, the
experience
eternal spirit, I think.
eternal spirit.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, that I think is what I called it. They evoke the eternal spirit of Greek religion. And Carl Karenye's
Hmm.
articles and books are sometimes cited in that respect. So, as far as how we might be able to help in a funny way, I think it's the same way that we could help anyone. I'm a huge proponent of scholars writing clearly so that people can
Hmm.
actually understand what the heck they're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think Walter Burkert, who was a friend of mine, didn't always do that so well. I think he could have done it better. So I think that's a way that we can help you better than we have in the
Mhm.
past. I think also what I have increasingly tried to do is when I'm talking about an ancient concept, I always give it in Greek or sometimes in Latin, as the case may be, because scholars need to know what that word was. But I try to make sure I never fail to give it in English. And that sounds like a really simple thing, but it's not just that people who don't read Greek and Latin want to know what the heck the word means. It's also that if you're seeing it in your own language, it sticks in your brain a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I understand. Yes, I think that's definitely something that I think American pagans would benefit from. I know from the Greek perspective, we can read the language. There's a lot, ease of access there, and that was one of the things that I've noticed when reading your paper. Because one of the things that I do is to discern the differences between me as a Greek practitioner and what Greeks are doing versus what pagans are doing. There's a lot of divergences. Namely, I've noticed less reliance on secondary sources when it comes to Greeks and a heavy reliance on secondary sources when it comes to Americans, for example. I think that I've seen works that people will quote when it comes to Greeks. They like to quote, I think, at times the books that are capturing the eternal spirit, as you say. I think those are popular. Yeah, I definitely think there's going to be, in any case, a lot that can be learned from scholars. Anyone who puts the time and the effort to really study something and unlock the meanings to things, bring it on. You know what I say? We welcome it. It was one of your books. I think it was which one was it? Greek religion, ancient magic. I'm sorry, the title of it is blanking at the moment.
I wonder whether you're thinking of, I never wrote a book with the word magic in the
Or it was a
title.
divination. It was the
Okay.
divination book. I think it was in that one because when I was reviewing a recently published pagan book, they were talking about how, the witches weren't punished by the gods for hubris. If you read the myths, witches aren't present in the myths. And it was actually your work that actually points out why that was, that Greek myths, the witches don't fit into the you know the narrative of the myth or what the myth is trying to do. And I thought it was so on point. So there's a lot that scholars can teach us when it comes to trying to understand the context of the ancient world. And I think that's the point I'm trying to get across at, is really trying to access the context of the ancient world, why something might be missing, and, instead of making assumptions, such as, again, like the pagans when they construct their religion, saying, oh, well, witchcraft is perfectly fine by the gods, because if you look at myth, they're missing from the myths as a character that doesn't get punished. Well, there's a reason for that, and scholars such as yourself can really provide a lot of context that people need to really understand the ancient world and the society in it.
I completely agree. And I really like your specific example, and I'll just briefly respond to it if I may.
Yeah,
That the one time in ancient myth where we see a witch being punished, and when I'm using the word witch here, I'm using it in scare quotes
yeah,
because it what we now mean by witch in popular culture doesn't really map on, but let's say a female practitioner of magic.
yeah,
The one time in ancient myth where we do see a female practitioner of magic being punished, of course, is Medea, who's punished first by her aunt Circe, who doesn't really forgive her for Medea having killed her own brother. And then, the gods allow all kinds of bad things to happen to Medea. And why they do that is an open question, at least among scholars. What is the point here? But it is the one little funny instance that I've been puzzled by.
yeah.
So it's the exception that proves your rule.
Yeah, and
And
also if I recall correctly, in that chapter, you point out that Medea isn't technically human. She is, is better understood as a divine figure within the narrative. So it's not even to say, because this is what, again, a modern practitioner of witchcraft or magic will say, is like, oh, Medea practice magic, and they equate Medea with themselves as a human. And it's, if you look closely at the mythology, Medea isn't really fully human. She's semi-divine based on her lineage. So yes, she does fit into more of the category as a divine agent acting upon humans, as I believe
right.
you pointed out, which is an amazing observation, and one that I really would encourage listeners who are into magic and witchcraft to really read that book that you wrote. I think it would help people understand, again, the context, and really understand the literature. What is happening there? Who are the characters? What's the hierarchy? What's the structure? Where's what's the perfect, not perfect, but what is the proper category to sort of understand the different actors and people and how they relate to each other? So I thank you for that work you did there. We talked about how scholars interact with the pagans and the scholarship that's being written. And as you mentioned, you spoke about, having respect and, for paganism. Now, on the other hand, for pagans, how would you suggest pagans who are interested in scholarship, how could they best interact with scholars and scholarly material to get the best out of it?
First of all, mutual respect. In all my years of teaching, I have very seldom had this happen, but it has happened, that neo-pagans have come up to me, when I'm teaching a class, and let's say it's a large enough class that I don't really know all the students very well.
Mm-hmm.
They have sometimes come up and in a somewhat supercilious way told me I was wrong. Well, that's
Oh,
not what Artemis would do,
that's
or well, that's not. And and I should also add, of course, it's not only neo-pagans who can be impolite students.
yes,
Politeness crosses all religious
of
boundaries.
course.
But that's the only thing I can really think of in an immediate sense of being affected as an individual scholar. If you want to look more broadly, though,
I think
I
the relationship, how do we build better relationships with scholars? What should pagans, practitioners keep in mind about scholars and academics and the work that's being produced in relationship to their religious identities? Maybe that's more a
oh,
specific
okay,
question.
okay, that our job and what we are judged on as far as being able to keep our job and as far as being able to get the pitiful little raises that we get every year is based on our ability to prove that what we have published is absolutely anchored in facts.
Hmm.
And we may have theories about it that we develop, but we always have to anchor it in facts. And those facts are coming out of ancient sources. Sometimes those facts from ancient sources are going to disagree with what a contemporary pagan feels about his or her gods and his or her religion. And we need to have kind of mutual tolerance there and understanding that we're after two different things. And the two
Exactly.
things don't have to be non-compatible. I think they can be compatible, but they are different things. And I want to tell you an anecdote about how they might be compatible. I had a doctoral student, an extremely good doctoral student, and she was working on the Homeric hymn to Demeter. And we somehow got on a rambling conversation in which she said, you know, the ancient gods are so nasty to people. I don't understand how modern pagans can worship them. And I said, well, I'll email my friend Sabina and ask her that question. And Sabina wrote back the most incredible response, really just thoughtful, lengthy, um, helpful response, saying that, well, neo-pagans believe that just as humans evolve, gods evolve, and that Artemis used to be one way, now Artemis is a different way. And so just as humans, we like to think at least, have evolved into being kinder, gentler species, so the gods evolved. And I thought that is such a beautiful statement of mutual respect. Respect for my student and I as scholars, that what we're seeing
Hmm.
in the ancient sources isn't wrong, but also, of course, respect for Sabina's own community, that the gods that they were worshiping are kind and helpful,
Yeah.
or at least often are kind and helpful, maybe not always, I'm not sure. So I often remember that when I'm thinking about issues such as the one that you just brought up.
Okay, very good. Again, there's another good example of, pagan scholar and classicist, this interesting back and forth in relationship, how, what you study the ancient forms and then you converse with Sabina who's doing the modern stuff, and this relationship and exchange. It's very interesting. To me, it's very interesting because, it's because I asked the question because this is something that I have, told pagans time and time again, that what I've noticed is that there seems to be a cult of academia within paganism where scholars are held up to be almost as priests, as people who provide exegeses, like interpretations and meaning to things. And they really take it to heart, like this is the truth, as if they were talking to the priest explaining the Bible to them. They built that sort of relationship, and I had to remind people, like, we have to be very careful when we do that. Sometimes there are really good observations that are relevant and are really pointing to a truth, and sometimes maybe it's not. We need to learn discernment. And
Right.
yeah.
I agree, but I would say that's the case for any religion.
Mhm.
If a person is a Christian, they might hear many, many wise things from their rector or priest or pastor, but they might also hear some pretty stupid things
Of course.
because that person's human.
Yes. Now, I would like to know, because this paper was written about 11, 12 years ago, do you have any desires to maybe revisit the topic and kind of update? I know that when you did the paper, you didn't do surveys of people. It was based on what you can find on the internet. And I think you referenced Sabina's work. So do you have any plans to do like a part two of this kind of area of research?
Not not in the immediate future because uh, I've learned more from various friends of mine who are folklorists about how you do these IRL sanctioned surveys. In other words, how you get permission from the government in order to talk to real people.
Oh, I didn't even know about this, to be honest. I didn't know that was a thing.
It's um, it's a real pain in the neck. It
Okay.
takes a lot of time to get the permission, and then you have to do the work in a very careful way. And if later it turns out you didn't do it in a careful way, you're not allowed to use any of it.
Mm.
Um, so that has kind of put me off it for the moment. I did discover there's a little crack in there that apparently, if you're a journalist, you don't have to do any of that. So
Oh,
there's a wonderful book by a woman named Lynn Schofield Clark called Angels and Aliens, and it's exploring contemporary adolescent religious tendencies. But she was a journalist, so she didn't have to get all that government permission.
Yeah.
So I suppose I could change professions. But so at the moment, I don't have the time and leisure to do that. I also think that in some ways the field, and this is a good thing, has moved forward so fast in recent years that for me to now catch up is a more difficult thing than it was even 12 years ago. I don't say I never will, just that it may be a time coming. I will say this, though, which might be interesting to your listeners. One of the book projects that I'm just about to embark on is a will be a long-term project on Hekate. And so I'm going to go back to some of the things that interested me in my first book, but also some things that I have more recently found out about how she was viewed in antiquity.
Hmm.
So
She's a
I
very
don't think
popular goddess with the witches and pagans.
that's why I thought I'd mention it. I may
Yeah.
not be working on neopaganism, but I'll be working on the goddess.
Oh, very good. I'm looking forward to that. And would you have any advice for people who might be doing this sort of research, such as myself? This is a topic I'm very interested in researching how pagans use scholarship to construct their religions and just, keeping tabs on what's being produced.
What I would say is find yourself a friendly scholar of ancient religion that you can ask questions of, because it's hard for us to keep track of what's going on out there. And so for someone who's not a professional scholar who knows exactly, what databases to look at and then how to evaluate what the databases say as far as what's being published, I think it would be really hard. But I don't mind it within reason if a neo-pagan, or for that matter, someone else, occasionally writes to me and says, I just found this article on, magic in archaic Greece. It's by so and so. Is that any good, do you think? I can say, well, not really. They don't know what they're talking about.
Hmm.
Or, yeah, that's a great article. Hopefully, your listeners live close to a college or university where they might be able to meet someone like that, or they meet them in some other way. Short of that, I think you slowly figure out which scholars you can trust.
Hmm.
And maybe you do it by comparing notes with other people. And then you look at those scholars' bibliographies and just keep reading.
Okay, very nice. Thank you for that. And is there any other thoughts you want to share on the topic before we?
Oh,
Mhm.
I was going to tell you about the book that will replace Walter
Oh,
Burkert.
yes, you mentioned that. What is it? Is it something you're
Oh,
writing?
no, but in all fairness, I should say it's something my husband is writing. My husband is Fritz Graf. Some of you may know his book,
Yeah.
Magic in the Ancient World. And as a matter of fact, his doctoral advisor was Walter Burkert.
Oh.
So Fritz has just retired, and he is spending his time finishing his long-term project, which is a history of Greek religion.
Oh.
When I say it replaces Walter's book, I don't mean that Walter Burgert's book was bad. It's brilliantly good. But that book was written in 1984. I mean, the
Mhm.
German original was. So it's about
To use the
time for
academic term, it's dated, right?
dating.
It's time for an update.
Yeah, both because theory and methodology have changed, but also because we've got new data.
Yeah.
So my husband, for example, is going to be able to talk about Greek religion during the Mycenaean period,
Oh.
which Burkert couldn't do because there wasn't enough out there for him to know at that
Hmm.
time. So my husband says, at least, that he's going to turn the manuscript into the press. It's been commissioned by Yale University Press. He says he's going to turn it into Yale sometime this fall. And if he keeps to that, then it would be out, I'd say, in fall of 2024.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
I've not seen much of it yet. He's been very close
Secretive.
with.
How could he keep that? You got to share.
Well, I know his passwords. I could sneak down in the middle of the night
Yes.
and,
Open the laptop and be like, what are you working on?
are you working on? But I don't think he has a working title for it yet. But you can find it under his name
Oh, cool.
eventually.
Very
Yeah.
good. And you also have a new book that just came out too recently. So I want to transition to that too to tell people about your new book. It's tell everyone the title again. I have it here with me.
It's called Gods and Mortals, Ancient Greek Myths for Modern Readers. So this is not a scholarly book, although it's informed by my scholarship on myth
Mhm.
for all these decades. It's my retelling of Greek myths. And I've tried to be simultaneously true to the ancient sources, but lively, engaging, telling an actual story. And actually, I thought about neo-pagans a lot while writing that book because the gods, as I was writing it, the gods became so real to me. This was all I did for about 3 hours every single day would be devoted to this.
Mhm.
But they became very real to me with their faults and their more pleasant aspects. And I thought about neo-pagans because I thought how interesting it is to live in a polytheistic world.
Mhm.
Like most people in America, whether they are devout or not, I was raised in what is essentially a monotheistic world, and polytheism is extremely interesting.
It is. It's never boring. There's always, the myths are they're mysteries to unravel from my perspective. It's very common for pagans to have a very literalist kind of view of things where they're like, oh, I don't like Zeus. He's so mean in the myths. But that's a very common, something you'll hear within pagan conversations like online, somewhere like that. But from the Greek perspective, we kind of like we don't really like lean into the mythic narrative in a very literal way. We try to, I guess, lean more into the philosophical interpretations that you can find from like Platonism, for example, to try to get more meaning out of it. The story is there for us to reflect on. We're supposed to reflect on them and see what's hidden within the myth. Like that interpretation process.
And that's absolutely valid. I think it's important to remember that the reason that we really still have the myths or are aware of the myths is because they have meant different things to different people as the centuries rolled on.
Yes.
And if they had not been capable of changing to suit different people's interests, they would have died. So I absolutely agree that using Platonism is one way to find meaning in those myths and and go for it.
What was during the writing process for the book, what was the most challenging aspect of writing? Because I know you did a lot of adding to it. What I liked what you did was again the context of like the ancient world. I like that. So can you provide anything that you really enjoyed, either being challenging or an enjoyment? What was during the writing process when you were retelling the myths? What can you share in terms of that process?
The same thing was both challenging and enjoyable, and that was the writing process itself, the finding of just the right word or just the right phrase. I've lived with these myths since I was 3 years old, and that's all I wanted my mother to read to me. I've lived with them so long, and I wanted to do right by them. I wanted to tell them in a way that satisfied me, but that would also satisfy other people. And so I would sit there sometimes for it seemed like hours, it probably wasn't really, to write one sentence. And then
Hmm.
I edit the sentence. And when I was done, I was usually at least relatively pleased with it. But um, it was sometimes a struggle. So
Hmm.
I, I hope this doesn't sound hubristic, or if it is hubristic, I hope the gods of the myths aren't listening. But I felt like I knew who the gods were and I knew who the mortals were, or at least I knew who they were to me.
Hmm.
Just finding a way to put them on the paper that was challenging.
I understand. Yeah, it's not an easy task, to take ancient myths and to retell them, or to, for the modern reader, because I guess again, language style, what you put in to really build the picture Like I remember reading the Pandora myth as you retold it, and the extra details to it of like, in the house, the jars, she kept them in the ground to keep them cool. Like it really paints the picture so you can really bring it to life. That, I don't think, for example, in the ancient world, they would have been that detailed because that stuff would have been just taken for granted. So they needed to narrate that. But I think today, as modern readers, it's very important to add in these details so people can build a picture of what it might have looked like back then. And I appreciate that you did that kind of work. I think it will help people connect to the myths in a new way.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to hear that because um, I enjoyed doing that, but it was in fact a lot of work. So I'm I'm glad that
Yes.
it worked for you.
Very good. Now I think I asked social media if anyone who is a pagan or polytheist, if they could ask a classicist a question, what would they ask? And
Uh-huh.
I hope this isn't too far out of your time field. I don't know. You're more into the classics. I don't know how far into late antiquity you go to into. I love late antiquity, and someone actually asked me the question concerning Julian, and if Julian had lived and succeeded, and restored polytheism, what might it have looked like today? And then I would also ask my own twist on that. If pagans today could see an alternate universe where Julian succeeded and we're in the year 2023 and there's polytheism, would pagans recognize it and would they like it?
Those are incredibly good questions,
Yeah.
which I've never thought about. Even though I'm quite interested in Julian, I think one reason I've never thought about them is what people like me are often asked instead is, why did Christianity succeed?
That's
Why?
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we don't have a good answer for that either. It's sort of mystifying
Mhm.
even to scholars. Why did that particular
Yeah.
religion take off? So I've been so busy worrying about that I've never thought about the opposite
Okay.
possibility.
Yeah. It's
Uh,
it would make for a great like alternate like fiction
yeah,
book. These someone needs to write that book, the year 2023 and it's polytheism. And I think pagans today wouldn't have liked the world that if Julian had succeeded because he modeled a lot out of Christianity, like he built a priestly class and things like that. So I think you probably would have probably had a world similar to almost like how Catholicism has like like a pope and all these hierarchies. It would be very hierarchical, and I don't think
yes.
pagans would really like that if they could see it.
Plus, you have to remember that Julian was an emperor. He
Yeah.
had a lot of advantages, a lot of free time, a lot of money at his disposal. And from what we can tell about his particular brand of what, for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call theurgy, I'm not sure whether that ever could have been spread abroad to a broad variety of people who did not have the advantages that
Mm.
Julian did.
It's not accessible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a much shorter way of saying what I'm getting at. It wouldn't have been accessible. And so I don't know what it would have ended up looking like. But I really agree with you that someone should write a book,
Yeah.
a fiction book, exploring what that would have been like. Of
Mhm.
course, Gore Vidal wrote that book on Julian, which is itself bizarrely entertaining,
Yeah.
but that's not quite the same thing.
Yeah. I have a mixed relationship with Julian. I appreciate like the enthusiasm, but I think he was too he I think he suffered from that what there's a term for converts when someone converts to a religion they become very fanatical or
Yep.
I forgot what the term is, but you could tell he was just like he wasn't on the same page as the rest of society, it seems like.
Yeah.
I think he was too overzealous, and I think it ultimately, in the end, I have to agree with Magistina Calhos. I think that's how you say her last name. I've been reading a lot
Uh-huh.
of her work, and she writes how, because of his actions, there was a lot of backlash from Christianity. It caused a lot of, I think, fear in people. And when you read later history, you just see the specter of Julian haunting, Greek writers and Greek Christian, authors. Like they always refer back to Julian, for example, in with Plethon in at the end of the Byzantine Empire. I forgot who it was who said it, but they said, "Oh, he suffered the same affliction that Julian suffered from, and it's this Julian is just this specter that haunts Christianity for the centuries after, and I just think he really ruined things in the end for polytheists of the ancient world. So I don't put him up on a pedestal like other pagans usually do.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I don't think he ruined it all by himself. I think plenty of people helped him ruin it. And I don't just mean the Christians. I think as much as I admired aspects of Neoplatonic thought, the Neoplatonists as a whole weren't
Mhm.
exactly doing a great job of selling what they had to offer, or at least not selling it in a way that the average person would find it easy to respond to.
Yeah,
And, again, I'm making horrible, vast
yeah,
generalizations
of
here.
course we have to in these sorts of conversations.
Well, I'm about to make one about Christians.
Okay.
What one thing that the Christians tended to be good at was helping people understand what Christianity had to offer the average person, or even let's say the below average person, the person who was poor, the person who was, on the borders.
Marginalized. Christianity spoke to marginalized groups. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Neoplatonism did not speak to marginalized.
No, it didn't. And I definitely think that's part of the a contributing factor to what happened in late antiquity with Christianity being popular. I've always looked at Christian. Now this is just an observation. Seeing, for example, like the Orthodox liturgy and everything, and I look around at some of the things I go, this is just theater. I feel like what they've taken was the actual theurgy of the Neoplatonists, so an activity which would everyone would have to participate in. You as a follower of that tradition would have to do the theurgy yourself and participate. What I think Christianity does is they made it into more of a theatrical, passive experience where people could gather together and watch the priest do the theurgy, and you don't have to do it yourself. All you have to do is just receive the communion at the end to do your part. And I think that's
Right.
part of the accessibility. They were able to just make things more accessible to the average person.
Yeah. Uh, it's interesting too, though, that theurgy was a little bit weird, even if you set it against paganism of the time in the respect that you're just talking about, because although anyone could sacrifice an animal or
Yeah.
whatever, it wasn't usually an average person doing it. It was, again, the priest. So
Mhm.
the highly theatrical parts of ancient religion were priest done,
Yeah.
so to speak. Um, if you were a woman who's worried about her child, maybe you offer an outpouring of wine and honey to Demeter asking for her help with the child, but that's not theatrical. So theurgy really is sitting in a very interesting
Hmm.
place.
Yeah.
You've made me think about it in a slightly different way from what I had before.
Hmm. Now, just I think one last question. This is just to ask you as a scholar, when you are needing to recharge yourself and be re-inspired in your discipline, where do you like to go or what do you like to do?
Yeah, there's two places that recharge my battery. One is the annual meeting of academics who work on religion. It's called the American Academy of Religion
Hmm.
/ Society for Biblical Literature. And the Society for Biblical Literature half, the name is very, very old fashioned. What it really means is anyone working on ancient religion. So going
Okay.
to that part of the annual meeting is always good for me
Yeah.
because I see my academic friends, I hear interesting papers. The other place that I really like going to, and it's a place that a I see both scholars and I'm not sure what the right collective term is. Well, if I tell you about it, you'll understand better. Is Esalen, which is a retreat place in Big Sur, California. But Esalen has a Center for Theory and Research that holds conferences, and the conferences last about a week, and they're very small. They might be only 20 people who are there by invitation. And what's interesting about Esalen is it will have scholars there like me, but it will also have practitioners of unusual religious or spiritual practices or experiencers, so people who have experienced near death experiences
Hmm.
or Um, the last time I was there a few months ago, we had tulpamancers. So it's bringing together scholars who want to understand those phenomena better as scholars,
Hmm.
but also people who are participating in those practices or who are experiencing the phenomena and want to understand what they have experienced better. So when I go to one of these sessions at Esalen, I get not only lots of new ideas per se, but lots of new ways of even thinking about the ideas that I had before.
Oh, that's really
And,
interesting that exists. That's so cool.
and it's also nice that it's in Big Sur, California. You know, that always helps to recharge the batteries
Yeah.
too. But yeah, so I think those are the two places I go to. Oh, the other conference I went to, only once sadly, was Pantheacon. And of
Hmm.
course, now
It's
Pantheacon is,
closed. Yeah.
yeah. But I was lucky enough, Sabina arranged for me to give a lecture at Pantheacon about the goddess Demeter, which is what I was working on at that point. That was great. I had a lot of fun, but I also have to say, I met so many neo-pagans who were just lovely, interesting, vibrant people and treated me extremely kindly and forgave dumb things I said because I didn't know they were dumb things to be saying. I'm so sorry it's no more.
No, that's unfortunate. Another one will open up.
I hope,
These things are always spring up. I think there'll be another one eventually, different name or something. But
yeah.
yeah, I don't use the word pagan myself. I don't identify as pagan. So it's always an interesting relationship between me and people who do identify as pagan. I actually have a paper coming out in Equinox Publishing,
Oh, yeah.
by Paganism in 5 minutes. So I'm doing a contribution to that volume where I actually do talk about that, why some polytheists reject the term pagan. So that will hopefully be, accepted and, published. So yeah,
Well, I hope that the fact that I keep using the word neo-pagan
yeah.
has not offended you.
No, it's fine.
It's the one I'm used to.
Yes.
And yeah. But there's another example
Yeah.
of how scholars could be more supportive of you guys. If we would learn better, or I
Yes.
should say, if we could better learn.
The terminologies, I guess. And this is the problem though with that. And it comes to the voices being heard. So within, within the pagan sphere, you get a lot more of the what's the word? What voices are being heard, and it's usually amplified by pagans themselves and not, for example, Greeks. Like when we say we're not pagans, we kind of get like ignored, I feel like, from both pagans and scholars. They'll just say, well, you're still a pagan by my definition with a capital P, as the modern understanding of it. I explain it in my paper, but particularly with Hellenism, because that's something I'm hoping to have impact within academia, where when scholars in the future, when they refer to Hellenism or Hellenismos as a pagan religion, they start knowing to identify it as a what's happening there is cultural appropriation of the identity from
Right,
Greeks, which isn't by definition a religious identity for Greek people. It's a cultural identity, it's an ethnic identity, it's the label we use to identify our history, our language, our dances, our music, all the whole shebang of an identity. And what pagans have done is they've taken the term and turned it into a religious identity, and there's a conflict there. So a lot of my work is trying to raise awareness in academia of this problem.
well, and there's the other problem, which I've been told pagans have stopped worrying about, which is, of course, the etymology of the word pagan,
Hmm.
which means basically hick.
Yeah,
It's, well, you know this because you know Greek. It's the word that means the countryside. So someone who's pagan is a hick from the countryside,
yeah,
implying you must be stupid if you believe these
yeah.
things. So yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and sincerely, we scholars, I mean, we need to do a better job. Maybe there is, I was about to say, maybe there's something that should be done in specific, but I realized the idea I was going to put out there is not such a
Okay.
feasible idea. Let's just say a better job needs to be done.
Okay. Perhaps which voices are being, included, perhaps. I guess when future research is done, we try to capture a larger maybe audience, I think.
Well, that's sort of what I was stumbling towards. And then I realized that what I realized for the article I wrote was that my catchment was already so huge I couldn't control it.
Yes, it's hard to control. There's just so much out there.
And so I think inevitably at the moment we might be stuck in a situation where Scholar A is going to work on Hellenismos, Scholar B is going to work on people who identify as Wiccans, Scholar C is going to work on people who identify as neo-pagans. And maybe at some future date, a decade from now,
Mhm.
then we will be able to look more broadly at how these groups do and do not
Yeah.
share qualities with one another.
Hmm.
Right now, I'm talking as a scholar,
Yes.
I'm therefore
Yeah.
talking very analytically, but
I appreciate hearing the process. It helps.
uh,
Yeah.
well, I hope someone does that.
Yes, maybe I'll try and do it. Just
Yeah,
add it
there
to
you
the list
go.
of things to do.
Yeah, add that to your list of things to
Yes.
do
All
and
right.
say a little prayer to Hermes.
Yes. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to share before we close?
No, I've enjoyed this very much.
Me
So
too.
all I really need to add is thank you.
Thank
And
you. This is quite an honor for you're my first guest interview, and I couldn't imagine anyone else to just kick things off. This is amazing. This is a deep honor.
well, thank you. It's a deep honor to be number one. And good luck with your work.
Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your future publications and your husband's book too. I can't wait to see that too. Maybe have to get him on the podcast, and we could talk about the new discoveries he has found since Walter.
Well, I can tell you an anecdote. You can either include it on the podcast or
Okay.
you can cut it out if you find it boring. So many years ago, it was soon after that article that I wrote appeared. I got a phone call. Back then, we used phones. Um, and the woman said, my name is such and such. I'm a reporter for the Associated Press. I'm working on an article on neopaganism. I think she said neopaganism. Um, would you mind if I ask you some questions? And I said, no, no problem. So she asked me a series of questions that I answered as best I could. And then she said, great, this is good. I'm almost done with my work. There's a couple other scholars I need to get a hold of whose work I've also been looking at because I know the neo-pagans use it. I've had so much trouble contacting them. And I said, well, let me know who
Mhm.
they are. Maybe I know how to contact them. And she said, well, one is Fritz Graf. And I said, oh, he's outside mowing the lawn. I can get him for you. And there was this sort of a pause. He said, what? I said, oh, I thought you knew he was my husband. And she said, no, in this voice. And I said, well, do you want me to get him? And she said, well, no, don't.
Don't bother him with the lawn.
I can't talk to him right now anyway, so don't bother him. But then she said, the other person who I can't figure out how to get a hold of is Walter Burkert. And I said, oh, yeah, he was our teacher. He did my husband's doctoral dissertation, and I studied with him too. And she said, there was another very long pause.
Do you know
She said,
everyone?
no, no, worse. She said, do you people like all hang around together? And it's, and I said, well, yeah, I
Kind
guess
of.
so. Kind of. Yeah.
That's
So,
funny. That's funny. Definition of a small world.
definition of a
That's all.
small world.
That's awesome though. That's cool. I thank you for sharing that story. That made me laugh.
Yeah. Well, good. Thanks for having
All
me
right.
on.
Thank you. Take care.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye bye.